Well, Galilee was definitely not the place to be from if you wanted to be important. Their saying was, "Can anything good come out of Galilee?" And Nazareth, well, Nazareth wasn't even the best place in Galilee. Just a little ho-hum nowhereville in a backwater of the world. And the people there knew it. So I'm sure they were surprised when rumors started about the things that their hometown boy Jesus was up to. Traveling around with a band of followers, preaching, teaching. They'd heard he'd healed some sick people. There were even those who thought he might be the long-awaited Messiah. But these hometown people knew better. After all, he was just a boy from Nazareth, and nobody important would ever come from Nazareth. Now, that Sabbath, when he was back in town, they wouldn't have been surprised when he stood up to speak in the synagogue. After all, any man over the age of 13 had a right to do that. But they were astonished by what he said. Indeed, more than astonished, the word Mark uses is more easily translated as offended. They were offended. Just who did he think he was? This kind of wisdom couldn't come from a boy who'd grown up here and whose parents and brothers and sisters they all knew. And so they closed their hearts and their minds, and they rejected him. It was inconceivable to them that God could be at work in the commonplace, that God could be at work in someone they knew. Now, I'm sure Mark included this story of the inability of Jesus' hometown neighbors to accept him as a way to remind us that God doesn't work according to the world's standards. Jesus was outside the expectations of the people of Nazareth, which gave them a choice. They could open their minds and hearts to see God at work in the unexpected, or they could close their minds and hearts and buy into the prevailing wisdom that nothing good could ever come from an insignificant little town like theirs. Mark tells us that they chose to reject Jesus rather than open themselves to the reality that God was working in an unexpected way. Now, it may seem strange to us that they rejected Jesus' ministry and wisdom, or at the least that they weren't proud of the hometown boy makes good angle. And in part, that's part of the cultural difference between Jesus' day and our own. Witherington writes, "Notice that they neither dispute that he has wisdom or that he performs mighty works. They are just dumbfounded that it comes from a hometown boy like Jesus. More than just a matter of familiarity breeding contempt, this comes from the ancient mentality that geographical and hereditary origins determine who a person is and what his capacities will always be. They see Jesus as someone who is not merely exceeding expectations, but rather is overreaching. In other words, to use another folk saying, they think he's trying to be too big for his britches. He's trying to be something he can't possibly be." But we shouldn't feel too smug, because in truth, we're not so very different. This story isn't about just how some villagers rejected Jesus 2,000 years ago. It's also about how we ignore and reject him today. Now, sure, we believe in Jesus. After all, you're listening to me when we could all be doing something else. We don't have a problem with the idea that a boy from Nazareth could be someone very special, but in part that's because for us, Nazareth is the special place that Jesus is from, not the ordinary one we live in. And we know the rest of the story. But just like the people of Nazareth, we often still have trouble really trusting that God is at work in our life, in our church, in our world. Jesus asks us to believe that nothing will be impossible with God, not in our lives, not in our church, no matter what the obstacles may seem to be. But faced with the idea that God is active in our lives in unexpected ways, we easily fall into the same trap that they did in Galilee. It's easy to think, God isn't going to do anything amazing here. We're not important or particularly noteworthy. We're too young, too old, too rich, too poor, too busy, not busy enough. If God is going to do something amazing, it'll be somewhere else, not here, not to us. And if we let ourselves fall into that trap, it could well be written of us, he could do no deeds of power there. Not because God doesn't have the power, but because our own fear can prevent us from accepting it in our life. I think we sometimes assume that when Mark says Jesus could do no deeds of power in Nazareth, it's because their lack of belief somehow blocked his ability to perform miracles, implying that if they had just believed in him, he could have done a great deal more. But the majority of miracles that Mark relates in his gospel don't actually involve any particular faith on the part of the recipients. So maybe the people's lack of faith in him didn't block his power, but simply resulted in them not bothering to seek Jesus' help in the first place. They didn't bring their sick for healing. They didn't bring their children for blessing. They didn't come to listen to his teaching. Faith implies action. Without faith in Jesus, the people did nothing. And so they gained nothing. And that, of course, is equally and sadly true for us too. If we don't seek God's help, if we don't step out and risk in the faith that Jesus will bless our work and our ministry, then we gain nothing. Now, it's often said that many Christians, if not the majority of Christians today, are functional atheists, meaning that although we do believe in God, on a practical level, we live our life and we function as though there were no God. We act as if everything depends on us alone and God has no part in what happens. We don't try to discern what God is up to so we can join in. We just try to power through everything on the basis of our own ideas and plans. And that lack of active faith, that lack of trust in God as an active participant in our life and ministry, keeps us from reaping as many blessings as God could otherwise give us. As Williamson writes in his commentary, the spiritual climate of a congregation, its sense of expectancy, its openness to the power of God at work through Jesus Christ will, in fact, have a great deal to do with how much God's power can accomplish in that particular community. Our unbelief does not render God impotent, but when it's dominant in a congregation, its dampening effect on the mighty acts of God in that time and place is evident and sad. Fear and functional disbelief are the easy route in our culture. living as if we really don't think God is active in our life may seem, on the surface, like the safe thing to do. Perhaps, though, all that really gets us is nothing. Perhaps we're being called to risk following paths that aren't safe and predictable and securely in the budget. Perhaps we are being called to a lifestyle of more radical vulnerability, dependence, weakness, and trust. Of prayer rather than just action. Of listening for the voice of God in our midst rather than trying to simply power our way forward towards our definition of success. Just like the people of Nazareth, we have a choice. What might happen if we chose to open our minds and hearts to the presence of God already in our midst? What might happen if we trusted that God is supporting of it and focused on what we can do rather than what we fear we can't? What blessings might God be able to give us if we opened ourselves to the power of God working through us and our community? Well, maybe we should try to find out.